This is the cenotaph in Montreal, and it commemorates tens of thousands of Montrealers who fought in the Great War. Amongst the men honored here are my grandfather, Randall Christie, and his brother, John. John and Randall Christie were typical of the more than 400,000 Canadian soldiers who served overseas during the Great War. Randall was a driver with a field ambulance, and John served as an officer of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Millions of Canadian families have Great War roots. The 100th anniversary of the Great War has increased our interest in what our family members did during that war. But the Great War generation are all gone. So how do we find out what they did, what they experienced? A few years ago, I took my son and my father, a World War II RCF pilot, back to France to rediscover my grandfather's war. These are the Great War roots of one Canadian family, my family. I'm military historian Norm Christie. I've been touring the old Western Front for 30 years. By visiting the famous and not so famous cemeteries and battlefields, you'll get a unique perspective on the war and the men and women who fought it on the Great War Tour. This street is part of my personal history. I grew up here in the late 1950s and early 1960s as part of the baby boom generation. And this street was always full of kids. There was road hockey at the bottom of the hill. The girls would skip at the top. We were always having fun. But what we didn't realize was that we grew up in the shadow of great events, and the players were members of our own family. This house over here was my introduction to the Second World War. This was my house. Actually, this looks nothing like my house. It was a simple bell top, and what would be the right side of this building today, which is quite majestic. My room was the middle one, and I shared it with one of my three evil sisters. The doorway was over here, and I always remember the winter morning that I decided to put my tongue on the metal railing. Of course, I lost part of my tongue and learned a great lesson. In the summertime, we go to the backyard. That's where we buried our family hamsters. That's where we read our comic books. That's where we'd play, because that's all we ever did. I like to say my father told me great stories of the Second World War, but of course, like all World War II veterans, he kept his stories to himself. However, it was no big deal. Everybody's father was a Second World War veteran. So we would come out here, and in the wintertime, of course, we'd come up, follow the hills of snow all the way to school. We'd play King of the Mountain. We played outdoor hockey, and all the kids would be crying at intermission because their feet would be frozen. This hill was always my nemesis, and although today it's not really a slope, they must have changed it, because in 1960, this was a huge hill. And I can remember going down here on roller skates, always wiping out. This house over here was my introduction to the First World War. This was my grandfather's house. You could say, for me, the Second World War was at the top of the hill, and the First World War was around the corner. I still remember this place as a sanctuary. I like to say that he told me a lot about the First World War, but if the Second World War veterans were bad, the First World War veterans were even worse. They kept their secrets close to their heart. I would have loved to have sit down and talked to him about these things, but I didn't. I knew he was at Vimy, and I knew inside the house there was all sorts of things from the First World War, but I never really knew what they were. I used to sit with my grandfather on this step. There's still a photograph of us together. I remember he had a scar on his face. I remember there was silks on the wall. There was in Flanders Fields up on the wall, but of course it had no meaning to me. He didn't tell me much. I knew he'd been in great events. I knew he'd been severely wounded. Vimy had come up, some tunnels. But I really didn't know his story. So the question is, how do you find the answers to questions you never asked? And for me, there's one place to go. We're going to go back to Ottawa and talk to my grandfather's firstborn, Norm Christie Sr., my father. We've come to Ottawa to talk to my father, to find out more about what my grandfather did in the First World War. I brought my son Lachlan along, and it's to his generation I'll be passing my torch.
My father talked to me when I was growing up and told me about my family and the stuff that they'd done and accomplished, and told me about like different wars that my family members were in and interesting stuff like that.
Well, we're here to talk about the war.
Oh, come on in.
So what we're trying to do is put Granddad's story together about where he went in the First World War and ultimately make a pilgrimage to where he went, you know, all the different villages and towns, and Vimy, of course. So what we're trying to do is piece the story together. What can you tell me, what did he tell you about the First World War and his experiences?
Well, absolutely nothing. He never told me anything about the First World War.
But you knew that the people, like his brother John, you knew that they had served, or did you just not know anything? I mean, there must have been something sort of in the atmosphere.
I knew his brother John served because I had seen a picture of the two of them. But even when John was over, which was very seldom, they never spoke of the war. There was never any talk of war at all. In their own minds, they must have figured never again would they ever go through that type of thing that they went through in World War I, and they just buried it. They didn't talk about it. They didn't.
Well, but when the Second World War came and you signed up, then you think he would have said something to you.
I know I would have. It was a different war, too, than World War I. So you wouldn't have gone through the same type of thing except for a very short period.
So for you, though, even the Second World War, after you came back after the war, you guys never talked about it either, did you?
No.
Talking to my father didn't really give us a great deal about what my grandfather did during the First World War. Now we're going to have to resort to other sources. Some of them are the regimental histories. And this is the regimental history of the No. 8 Canadian Field Ambulance, and this is the unit my grandfather belonged to. But these will only take you so far. Often you have to use other types of artifacts. And First World War soldiers were very proud, and they had a tendency to keep things, even if they didn't talk about it. And my grandfather was no different. We have his medals, which he kept hidden somewhere in a box for years and years and years. There's the drivers of the No. 8 Field Ambulance. And other artifacts, cap badges, shoulder flashes that he used during the war. But the real treasure trove are his photo albums. We found them in a box after my uncle died, and it's got all his photographs of his friends, the places they were, and of course the postcards. And all of them have his writing on the back. So in his words, he describes the places he went to. And of course, the route starts in Montreal. To follow precisely in my grandfather's footsteps, I've come back to Point St. Charles in Montreal. It was the old Scots-Irish ghetto, and it was here in around 1880 that my grandfather's father came from Scotland. He worked in the rail yards, and of course, you can hear the trains going by now. Both my grandfather Randall and his brother John were born here in the 1890s. And here they were educated, and here they would work. And all we have to do now is to cross the street to go back to 1915. I'm sure my grandfather didn't have to endure this sort of traffic in 1915. I do know that he went to school in this area. This is where he lived his early part of his life. I know his brother John also went to school here, elementary school, no more. I know that he started work as a 16-year-old as a clerk in the Bell Telephone Company of Canada. And I also know both John and Randall lived on this street, Congregation Street, in 1915. And this is when they enlisted in the Canadian Army. In 1915, after reading the casualty lists and watching their friends enlist, both brothers joined the Canadian Army. My grandfather joined the Canadian Army Medical Corps in August, and a few weeks later, John joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry through the Overseas Universities Company. And it was through this doorway they took their first steps to Tipperary.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go.
Within weeks of enlistment, my grandfather and his brother were sent overseas. Both received further training in England, and in the spring of 1916, they were sent to fighting units in Belgium. Coincidentally, both men joined units of the newly formed 3rd Canadian Division in the fields near Ypres. It was here, south of the Flemish city of Popering, that their war truly began. Here, my grandfather joined the Calgary-based 8th Canadian Field Ambulance as a motorized ambulance driver, and John Christie joined an infantry regiment, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. It is difficult to imagine how my grandfather would have felt when he arrived. The front was very close, and he must have found the sounds and flashes of the artillery fire very intimidating.
That's weird.
And that's, yeah.
Right now we're on the outskirts of Popering, and this is where my grandfather first came into the line in 1916. Popering was the center of operations for the Ypres salient. Everything was going on here, the big hospital centers, all the munitions, the troops would go up to the front, they'd come back for rest. And of course it was also the main medical treatment facility. They were brought into what was called Vimy siding, which was a railway siding. They had a casualty clearing station. This area, known as Vimy siding, is our first step in our journey to discover their war. This is the Lisenhoek Military Cemetery, and this is roughly where Vimy siding came off, which was that railway cutting. So the idea here was that all these areas that are all fields now were tents. They were casualty clearing stations, and they had convalescence depots, rest camps. And when Granddad first came in, he came here in these fields. So what he did there was they were just in charge of rest camps. So he got here around May 10th, 1916. Not much was going on. Still, Ypres is always dangerous, but there was no battles or anything like that. So his early job was quite easy. He didn't have to do very much. So at the same time, John arrives, and he's now joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And by the end of May, they're going into the main salient. In fact, they're in a place called Sanctuary Wood. And everything has gone quiet until on June 2nd, 1916, the Germans blast the entire Canadian front line. And all of a sudden, everything is in chaos. And the ambulances start their run down towards Ypres to pick up the wounded. And of course, this is where they incur their first casualties. And in the meantime, back in Sanctuary Wood, the Princess Patricias are being annihilated. The brunt of the attack fell on the 3rd Canadian Division, and my grandfather's field ambulance was rushed into action. With no battle experience, the men pushed forward into heavy artillery fire to aid the evacuation of 7,000 wounded Canadians. Many of those did not survive their wounds, and they are buried in Lisenhoek. This is the second largest in Belgium, but it's all died of wounds cases. There's 11,000 burials here, including 1,000 Canadians that were killed in 1916, 1917. So what we're looking for is plot 7, because during the Battle of Montserrat, 2 of the field ambulance guys were killed, and they're both buried here. So Granddad would have been with them.
Hospital of the Sacred Heart, known as the Asylum. Beautiful structure. Has advanced dressing station in basement and many thousands of wounded pass through. 18 of our men wounded or killed in yard. Shell landed amongst them while unloading wounded.
So this is Sanderson, and these guys have only been around for less than a month in the line, and he was one of the first guys killed. There's a second one that was killed. They were killed about 12 kilometers from here. So the men in the field ambulance loaded them up and drove them back. And you can be sure Granddad would have been part of that. And to have the first guy killed would be a bit of a shock. So look for the other guy. He's buried in the other row here. Private E.F. Abel from Winnipeg, and it says 3rd of June, 1916. And he's got the "All gates are good through which we pass to God."
This first baptism of fire for the members of the field ambulance was a severe initiation, but the men stood it well, working unceasingly under the difficulties of unfamiliar roads and trenches, and under a very intense and continuous bombardment from the enemy. These were indeed trying days, and it was a great relief when the activities subsided, more especially as the Germans had been pushed back, and their attack, though causing many casualties, was unsuccessful.
All the numbers are really startling. You can read about it and talk about it, but unless you look at it, you don't really get the feel. Yeah, and this is only one of many, but it's amazing. Yeah, you wouldn't want to bring the recruits through here.
You were 16 when you joined up?
Well, yeah, sure. That's when I became a boy soldier. And that started from my love for horses. And the horse love came from Seabiscuit. Seabiscuit in 1936, 37 became very famous with War Admiral race, and I tried to find out how I could ride horses, and the only available place was the 17th Duke of York's Royal Canadian Hussars. It was a cavalry regiment, and it was right across the road from the stables. And I was 16, and I joined them, and I became a boy soldier. And there I got riding lessons. I did some exercising on the weekends with the horses. And I eventually became a signaller. But that's how I joined the Army.
So does this surprise you, what we're finding?
Oh, yes. It really moves you to see all this. Yeah. You know. It's such a waste of life.
Over the next 3 months, my grandfather remained in action in the Ypres salient. His job was to evacuate the wounded, picking them up at designated advanced dressing stations along the Poppering Road and driving them back to the casualty clearing station at Vimy Siding. Although there was no heavy fighting, the stream of wounded was constant, and the roads that the ambulances drove on were constantly being shelled. This is the road from Poppering to Ypres that all the field ambulances used to drive down to meet with the wounded, pick up wounded at the advanced dressing stations. This is the first one, and this is where Granddad definitely went, here to the asylum, which was one of the advanced dressing stations. But because they had so many wounded from the salient, they had 2 or 3 other ones that you'd have to make trips out to get. So we're going to go down to the prison. And what's amazing, these buildings, although severely damaged in the war, have been rebuilt to be almost exactly as they were.
Ypres prison, used as a dressing station and billet. Badly damaged. Struck several times, but no casualties. No movement allowed during daylight. Ypres, Lille Street. Passed up this street every night. All the buildings on both sides destroyed completely. Had 3 Red Cross stations in the ruins for some time. Ypres, Grand Place. Large square, but totally destroyed. Very busy pace during night, as all traffic for the front passed through the square and was subject to heavy shell fire. Famous Cloth Hall on right. I was here. May to August, 1916.
Ypres was never a quiet place, and the ambulances were busy every night. My grandfather's ambulance had pickups at several advanced dressing stations, always along the major transport route. At Vlamertinghe, we stopped at a local pub to quench our thirst, as thousands of soldiers had done in 1916. Maybe one of those soldiers had been my grandfather. We are looking for an advanced dressing station used extensively by the 8th Field Ambulance, the Vlamertinghe Mill. We inquire at the pub, and the owner has a surprise for us. He shows us an old picture from the war.
And the Vlamertinghe Mill is over here.
Yeah.
That's the mill.
What's the middle?
So that was the advanced dressing station in the summer of 1916 where Granddad was. So for sure, he had a beer here. The mill over here. Here's the estaminet, where we just had our beer. And there's the church. Half the tower's been split because of the German bombardments. And there's the lines of trucks coming up, bringing the men out, taking men in. So they would take the wounded here to the advanced dressing station and then out to the casualty clearing station. And what happened was everything was quiet, nothing was going on. It was the summer of 1916. They're playing cards and smoking. And of course, all the action's going at night. All the trucks are going up and all the, artillery's moving back and forth. And one Canadian unit had just arrived. It was the 73rd Black Watch from Montreal. They had gone for their first tour where they had suffered no casualties in the salient, which is really good. And they're marching down this road, and right outside the mill, a German high explosive shell came in right in and wiped out a platoon. So automatically, their quiet, peaceful night just turned around immediately, and they had to come out and take care of the wounded. Boy, you're walking right in his footsteps. We're not kidding here. Yeah. This was a very important advanced dressing station, and they broke it into 2 parts so that they could handle the wounded coming in, because of course it was used again in Passchendaele. So it was used in 16, but then it really was used a lot in the fighting in 1917. And that's the second time Granddad comes here, because he's and it's even deadlier in 1917 than it was in 16. So these guys would die over here, die of wounds received at the salient, right up at the advanced dressing station, and they'd bring them out here and bury them. All the summer of 1916. Wow.
Amazing. I hope the beer tasted as good to him as it did today to me.
The next step in our journey is to follow my grandfather's route south in early 1917. We are driving to the old battlefields north of Ypres. Of all my grandfather's battles, this was the one of which he was most proud, the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The 8th Field Ambulance had the honor of evacuating our wounded from the trench lines just east of the village of Neuville-Saint-Vaast. When my grandfather was here in 1917, the place had been reduced to ruins by shell fire, proving it was a dangerous place to be.
So this is where the 8th Field Ambulance had their advanced dressing station. So he's got some postcards here.
The place where our advanced dressing station was for the Vimy fight was just at the foot of the ridge. I was lifted from the road and landed in a deep trench in April 1917 before the strafe. Fritz put a barrage on this town all night before and caught a lot of Canadians, and we were very busy. we had 2 killed here. Many exciting times have been had here. This road was always shelled heavily. I was blown into a shell hole full of water on April 8th, but not hurt. The road was completely flooded and near our knees in water while walking.
Once the attack started, the wounded started streaming through here. Then they would have to either take them by horse-drawn ambulance out to the La Targette crossroads. That's where they would pick up the motor ambulances. Then they would drive them back out to the front. So there was thousands of wounded coming through here.
Within minutes, the wounded were streaming back through Neuville-Saint-Vaast. 2,000 would pass through before the day was over. The regimental aid post moved forward into the German lines as the battle advanced. 10,000 casualties, including 3,500 dead. But the 8th Field Ambulance only lost 1.
And he was lucky that day. But the street was, he said, 3 feet in mud as you walk through. They got out thousands of guys through here.
John Christie was in the front line only 2 kilometers away when the big attack went in. On April 9, 1917, Sergeant John Christie was in the vanguard of the attack launched from a position known as the Crater Line. The Patricias swept across no man's land and drove the Germans off the crest of the ridge.
So we're just driving north out of Arras, and we're going to go to the Canadian Park at Vimy, the Canadian National Monument.
Vimy Park preserves the battlefield of Vimy Ridge of 1917 and still bears the scars of war, with shell holes, trenches, and tunnels, covered by a woodland of Canadian fir trees. When I was a boy, my grandfather told me about the tunnels at Vimy Ridge. At the time, I thought he was confused and he really meant trenches. Years later, on my first visit to Vimy Ridge, I finally understood what he meant. Today, their jump-off trenches have been preserved in Canada's National Park.
These are the trenches, and they, over the years in the 1920s, they cemented them all in, and they preserved a very small segment of the Canadian line and a small segment of the German line. So this is where John Christie was in April 1917. John, by 1917, he was a sergeant. He'd been promoted after the Battle of Mont-Sorel because there were so many casualties. So as a sergeant, he would be responsible for his section or his platoon. And you would be responsible for the garrison of this area for maybe a 24-hour period. Then you would go down underneath, another group would come up, and you'd spend about a week in various positions in this area before you would be moved out again. This had been fought over in 1915, so the whole area was full of mine craters and trenches and thousands of dead French and Germans. So this was a nasty front too. This was maybe comparable to Ypres in terms of not wanting to be here. If we get up here, we can have a look how close the Germans were. Okay, here we go. You want to come up?
Yeah.
I'll help you up. If you're okay?
Yeah. Okay,
See how close they are?
Yeah.
That wire is the German, is the German front lines. So they're only this far apart.
This crater in between, is that from shelling, or was that a natural?
No, that's underground mining. They used to tunnel under the other guys' positions and blow them up. So if you had a machine gun post, they would spend 3 or 4 months tunneling underneath, and then they would blow the whole thing up.
It's really close. I thought they were a lot farther away than that.
This was hotly contested. This is Vimy Ridge, and the French wanted every inch of the soil, so you didn't give up anything. And of course, John Christie's in this attack. And of course, the wounded are going down all over the place. The regimental bearers are coming, the ambulance bearers are coming, and they're starting to move them back where they're going to be picked up by the ambulances. They had a big honor, the 8th Field Ambulance, because they were in charge of clearing this front during the Vimy operations, which is the first really big job they were given. So this is where Granddad would have been.
The next major battle for my grandfather was near Ypres in 1917, the infamous Battle of Passchendaele.
And no soldier ever wanted to get assigned to Ypres. So when my grandfather came here in 1916, he must have had some indication that he was in for some real trouble.
There are very few remnants of the Great War that remain. Cemeteries, pillboxes, and memorials are the main ones. However, there is another very dangerous remnant. Each year, thousands of unexploded shells surface in the farmers' fields.
Apparently the farmers put those out for the collectors to pick up. Unexploded bombs. Sure wouldn't want to play around with those.
When I was living in France growing up, there was farmers' fields everywhere, and there was a fun thing to do is to go pick up remnants of the wars, like shrapnel balls, bullets, shell pieces, cartridges.
Imagine the farmers don't appreciate people wandering into their corn patch.
Finding live shells around Ypres is a common occurrence. There are also other remnants. The fields are full of millions of shrapnel balls. These are small lead balls fired from an 18-pounder shell that would explode overhead. And there are roughly 200 balls in each shell, and millions of these shells were fired. And today, they're some of the easiest things to find from the Great War.
What point does a farmer come out with a shotgun?
I don't know, hopefully not soon.
3 more bodies for Passchendaele.
Oh, another one.
Oh, Lachlan found more. He's got about 3 or 4, I think.
Yeah, you can see they're lucky shrapnel balls.
They didn't hit anybody.
Souvenir.
Yeah.
In the Passchendaele fighting, the work of the ambulances beggars description. Constant shell fire and a treacherous morass of mud tested the nerves of all men. We are looking for a regimental aid post located at Kronprinz Farm. Teams of stretcher bearers from the 8th Canadian Field Ambulance took the wounded from there 5 kilometers back to the collecting post at Ypres. Although my grandfather never talked about this battle, I cannot comprehend what he would have experienced.
This is what was known as Kronprinz Farm, and this was the regimental aid post for the front line just towards the end of the Passchendaele fighting. So the wounded were all up on the ridge. They'd be brought back by, let's say, a regimental stretcher bearers to the regimental aid post here, and then you would hook up with the 8th Field Ambulance guys, the bearers, who would then have to carry them back to Ypres. They couldn't get any communication for them because the shelling was so bad and the terrain, it was just all mud. This whole area was just pure mud, all the way through with little tracks running through it. They had no trenches, there was no protection unless they could find an old German bunker, and then they would have to take them back. You can actually see those old photographs where they're standing at the German bunkers, the stretcher bearers, you know, waiting for the call. They'd often have to have between 4 and 6 guys on a stretcher to take them through back, and in some cases they had to go as much as 6 kilometers back to Ypres before they could hook up with the ambulances. There was just no way to get them out other than carrying them. And also the Germans were up on the height at the Guteberg. They never lost that, and they were just shelling this area consistently. So the medical officer would be operating in this farm. They'd be brought back, and they'd start carrying them back towards Ypres. And I think there's 3 of them were killed in this fighting, just by shelling. 2 of them that were killed are on the Menin Gate. They never found their bodies afterwards, or they're unidentified. And the 3rd one, they found his body around 1919, 1920.
He's buried in Tyne-Cot Cemetery, which is sort of the cemetery that represents the Passchendaele fighting. Now, we don't know whether Granddad was a stretcher bearer at this point, because we know he was an ambulance driver, but they would often cycle them out. They had extra ambulance drivers, so they would put them into bearing details. This would be total mud. And every farm was a German defensive position. That's on both sides of us, and this would have been hell. This is where the guys, if you got wounded and you fell off the duck boards, you drowned. I think it says in the history that those who served at Passchendaele were never the same again. And no one could forget the horrific conditions of the battle. But it was for everybody. It wasn't just the fighting soldiers, it was everybody that was caught up in this.
One can never forget the haggard looks of the men and officers as they returned from the battle, almost helpless with the fatigue of their work, and just looking for a place to sleep. These tours of duty in the Passchendaele area formed the most arduous the ambulance were called upon to perform.
Our next stop is Tyne-Cot British Cemetery. There my father and my son are going to look for the grave of one of my grandfather's comrades, Sergeant Frank Steele of Calgary. My grandfather never spoke to us about his fallen friends. Tyne-Cot is the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the world. It contains 12,000 Commonwealth graves.
Section 13, I think. Section 14, D13. Which I have no idea where it is. This is huge.
Ready for a long walk?
Yeah, it's gonna take a while. There's so many people here.
Oh, it's enormous, huh? It's unreal. Absolutely unreal.
There's so many unknowns here, too.
Yeah, you notice a lot of the stones, they're marked with unknown.
Yeah. They don't even know the country. They just find, like, some, like, mangled, like, remains in the mud. Okay, here's 14D.
14D, okay.
Yep, here it is. F. Steele, Canadian Army Medical Corps.
27th of October, 1917. Age 41.
It's amazing.
No, his remains were found in 1920.
It's so crazy that he didn't talk at all, considering, like, the craziness.
He never talked about being an ambulance driver either. He just never talked.
It's just like his friend just like disappears, into the mud for like 2 years.
Yeah.
And then, they just kind of like scoop him out of it, I guess.
Where I was, they got lost in the jungle. I could never find them. Some of them took years. Some were never found.
Anyone go in the jungle?
Not as bad as the mud, but it's...
Well, it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Now starting to understand what his father went through in the First World War, my father opens up about his war. He served 1944-45 as a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Far East, in Burma.
There's very dense jungle. And if an aircraft goes down, it's very, very difficult to find it. And if you don't see it in the first couple of weeks, the growth is so fast that it's covered. And every day we were flying or looking for somebody's aircraft. They had heavy losses from weather, mostly from weather. Flying weather is the worst in the world there. During the monsoon, you get the cumulonimbus clouds, which go well over 20,000 feet. Flying into them is very dangerous, and some of them are powerful enough to tear the aircraft apart.
Okay, well, how would you avoid getting torn apart?
Well, you don't fly into them. You fly around them, or you fly over, or in between them, but you...
And you have no idea where you're going when you're in them?
No, because if you're flying in cloud and it starts getting dark, then you better make sure you get the hell out. You're flying in a cloud, and it gets darker and darker, and suddenly it's black. And it's very turbulent. And so now you're at a point of no return. You don't know whether, if you can turn around and get out, or whether it's how thick the cloud is. But if you fly straight ahead, maybe you'll come out the other end quicker. So you have to make a decision. And if you stay in, you have very little control. It just takes your aircraft. There can be two of you on the wheel, and you haven't got the strength to hold it. It just takes your aircraft, throws it up, throws it in. You know, if you're in trouble, how long it seems. It seems like forever, but and we got thrown out. We came out on our side, thrown out of the side of the cloud. Now, once you're out of the cloud, you get control again, and you can come down.
Our journey into my grandfather's past has affected my father. It has given him an insight into his own father's life that he has never had before, and it has stirred his memories of his own war.
Going up to New-les-Mines, that's where he was stationed through most of that period in 1917, 1918. He went on leave to Nice in August 1917, and there's all the photographs of them down in Nice in their bathing costumes. Even some of them still have their caps on, with some nurse. That's the first leave he got. So this was part of the sort of exciting tourist aspect of their war. But when he came back here after Passchendaele, that's when he got in trouble. So you can see up here, it's the entranceway to the school. And this is where all the ambulances were parked in January 1918. And the drivers had spare time, so Granddad was playing cards with his buddies, probably with Bob Maxwell and those guys, you know, around. And a shell came up, went off. A fragment went through the roof and hit him in the left side of the face.
It's amazing to think that you got hit here, eh?
It's amazing that after all these years, you can actually retrace his steps. I mean, we've had, on this trip so far, we've gotten 3 or 4 places where we know he would have actually have been. At Vimy, you know, at La Targette, at Vlamertinghe, and now here, this is exactly where he was hit. This is where his life was almost ended, in which minute, for all of us, we wouldn't be here. We'd have a vanished scene. So they were just here. And he's lucky he got hit with the field ambulance, so the guys would grab him right away. They could put something on him right away, take him out through the gates, down to the main street, to the mairie, which is just over here. But he's lucky. If it had just been an inch or two over, he would have been killed. And it's it's like all quiet on the Western Front. Nothing was going on, just one shell, bang, and he catches him.
January 22nd, 1918. Sincerely regret, inform you. Private Randall Alex Griffin Christie, Medical Services. Officially reported admitted, 8 Field Ambulance Depot, January 16th, 1918. Gunshot wound face. Director of Records.
So we'll go to the Marie now, and just down this road here. So this is the mairie where the advanced medical station was. And when he was hit over at the school, they brought him here right away for treatment, which was a good thing because he was bleeding so badly from the left side of his face. They just want to stop the bleeding. So what had happened was the shrapnel had gone through his jaw and come out his neck and knocked out 10 of his teeth and fractured his both mandibles. They don't want to do too much because they can't reset anything because of infection and what could occur. So they're going to stop the bleeding, maybe reset some of it, as much as they could quickly, try to make him a little comfortable, and then he'd get in a field ambulance. They would take him to the casualty clearing station because, of course, for him, the war, this is the end of the war, right? He goes to England for recuperation. He goes through a reconstruction of his jaw, and that's where they put in the plate. I remember in the 60s he had some sort of operation on his face because they had to remove the cement they used to reconstruct the jaw. And as he goes to England, John Christie has just come back from being commissioned. He's now a lieutenant in the PPCLI. And from England, he's just really watching what's happening to John. His war is over.
And slowly he began to recover. In August 1918, he was moved to a convalescence home in Orpington. From there, he wrote to his mother in Montreal.
Dear Mother, hope all are well. I'm feeling pretty good now. My room has 4 beds and a fine fireplace. I bought the newspaper just now and noticed John's name in the casualty list as wounded. Don't worry, he's okay. All for now. Ran.
Since 1916, my grandfather's brother, John Christie, had fought in 4 major battles and survived without a scratch. During the Canadian advance east of Amiens on August 14, 1918, his company was cut off and surrounded in a desperate German counterattack at Parvillers.
We started to move the company back, and the Fritz were all around us. The company commander, Major Drummond Hay, was putting up a fight with a small party when a bullet hit one of the men, went right through his stomach and into my knee. And I was just going to speak to Drummond when he fell like a log and said, "John, I'm done." I tried to get him to his feet, but he fell dead right in my arms. I moved last night by ambulance train to number 8 General Hospital. I don't feel any pain unless I move. And of course, with a splint on, I don't move very much.
For his action at Parvillers, John Christie was awarded a Military Cross. His wounds were not severe, and he rejoined his regiment in October 1918 and participated in the capture of Mons on the last night of the war. My grandfather returned to Canada and was discharged medically unfit in January 1919. His wound had resulted in the loss of 10 teeth and the reconstruction of his jaw with a metal plate. For this, he received a gratuity from the Canadian government of $70. My grandfather's brother, John Christie, returned to Montreal in March 1919. The Christie brothers posed for a photograph to mark their safe return. It was just like the one they had taken when they had enlisted so long ago in 1915. My grandfather died in July 1972, and he's buried in Montreal Memorial Park. I haven't visited his grave in more than 40 years.
Here it is. Now, how do you think you could have done what he did during the war?
I think it's really hard to say. How can you... it's hard to put yourself in that place. I think it's just amazing the experiences these people had and how they continued on with their lives afterwards. All the carnage you must have seen being a stretcher bearer and working in the ambulance. I don't know how you could not mention that for 60 years.
And he only talked to a few people. There was a few veteran friends who used to visit.
Yeah.
But they never shared their experiences. But you could see in the house and the stuff that I have now of his, that he was an incredibly proud man. He was proud of what he had accomplished during the war.
Ypres.